Is PlayStation coasting through this generation? Welcome to PSReady, my channel all about PlayStation. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne, and in addition to that, we're going to talk about how it might be time for Sony to pick up Take-Two Interactive. All of this kind of ties together, so it's going to be a good video. This video is sponsored by Scry and their Nitro Flash heatsink SSDs. The best thing about the PS5, the PS5 Slim, and the PS5 Pro is that all three of them have an extra attachment slot for an internal SSD. And Scry's Nitro Flash heatsink SSDs will give you huge benefits like smoother gameplay, faster loading, and faster file transfers, which checks all three of my SSD boxes. They've got read-write speeds of 7,500 megabits per second, which is fast as hell and perfect for the PS5. And hey, let me tell you a secret. For this top speed performance, you're going to be paying competitive prices with the big boys. No matter which PS5 you've got, it supports Scry's SSDs, and they even have 2TB and 4TB options to have you covered at all storage sizes. And the coolest thing is, if you use my code PSReady at checkout on Scry's website, you'll get an extra $5 off. You should just buy one. They're awesome. Once again, huge shout out to Scry for sponsoring this video. All right, let's get into this first story here, which is coming from an op-ed I read over at Eurogamer that's positing the question of whether or not Sony is coasting through this generation. They bring up some really good points, starting out with how this generation started really strong with games like Horizon Forbidden West, God of War Ragnarok, Gran Turismo 7, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, Demon's Souls, Returnal, and Spider-Man Miles Morales. I'll count Spider-Man 2 in the mix, and then 2024 hit, and all we really got from the first party was Helldivers 2, which is a second party game, and of course Astrobot, which did win Game of the Year, but isn't the big heavy hitter type of game that a lot of people bought a PlayStation console to experience, especially coming off of the PS4, which had tons of excellent first party games all throughout its entire life cycle. And they also brought up a really good point, which is that the last two generations, the PS3 and PS4 generation, they both started pretty rocky. The PS3 started out way rockier than the PS4, but by the end of both generations, I mean, they had generation defining games coming out at the end that really bookended that generation really well. And if you look at the PS4 generation, a lot of those PS5 games I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, those also came to PS4. So like, you could look at it as getting even more games in the PS4 generation that really pushed the envelope. And then things kind of just stayed there for the rest of this generation. And I hope that doesn't happen. So when I think about this from the perspective of whether or not they're coasting, I don't think that's the case. I think it's more their chickens coming home to roost with a lot of the decisions Jim Ryan made at the beginning of this generation. Like, he came in as CEO of PlayStation, he got some games that Sean Layden had in production out the door, and then he drastically changed things. I'm going to talk about this over the weekend a lot in Shuhei Yoshida's interview breakdown, but yeah, he came in and he completely disrupted the way Sony works, and he took a lot of first-party studios that had only made single-player games with maybe a multiplayer mode tacked on that wasn't going to be like a live service or anything like that. He went in and he said, guys, cancel what you're doing and come up with a live service game. Naughty Dog, you better have a live service Last of Us. Ben Studio, we don't like Days Gone for no reason, so you better make something good that's live service. Firewalk, we're going to pay $400 million for you to put out your Destiny multiplayer clone, and it's going to totally bomb. Fair Games, which we're talking about later in the video, there is like a lot more than that in development as well, and slowly they've canceled 90% of those games, released one, which they ended up pulling off the store, and really the only one left is Fair Games. So to say they're coasting, I don't think is the case, because you can't just put a game into development and release it 2 days later. A lot of their biggest studios were working on live service games that got canceled, so they had to start development on games, and a lot of those games are probably going to either be at the end of the PS5 generation, or they'll be cross-generational between the PS5 and the PS6, because that's coming out in either 2027 or 2028. We do have some good stuff to look forward to from the first and second party, like Death Stranding 2, Ghost of Yotei, Intergalactic, The Heretic Prophecy, and Saros. I mean, that's a pretty good lineup right there if you're considering that most of those games will be out by the end of 2026, but there's not really anything super heavy coming that like gets me excited. I know there's going to be another God of War. That's really exciting to me, but it's going to take a while. I'd assume that that will be one of those cross-generational PS5/PS6 games. I'd love to see Uncharted come back. They said that they're looking back into their back catalog to revive some dormant franchises. We just need to wait until that happens, and that's probably going to happen towards the end of the PS5 generation. So like, I don't think they're coasting, because they're not. They are doing better than ever. Like, a lot of people are buying PlayStation 5s. They're making more money than ever, but they're basically in line with the PlayStation 4. And the biggest reason for that, I think, is mainly because their biggest studios were working on live service games that got canceled. That's a really simple answer to a really complicated question. There really needs to be some sort of reckoning here where they can figure out how to make games quicker. I understand that people are demanding better performance and better graphics, but like, there's better engines out there than the ones they're using. I like a lot of their internal engines. They seem to output like really well-made games that look and run phenomenally. And while there are some dud PC ports so far, a lot of those games do translate well to PC, which just shows that they're well made and well optimized. It seems like they're just kind of a victim to things like chips not really becoming as powerful generation over generation as they did back in the PS4 and PS3 generation. Like, that's slowing down a lot. They're also a victim of not having a big live service under their own umbrella that can just keep pumping billions of dollars in. And there's a lot of layoffs going on that are caused by bad decisions during the whole lockdown situation, where there was a ton of money floating around because people were spending a lot more money on entertainment, and they took that money and invested it into games that they probably wouldn't have if the lockdowns never happened. And lo and behold, a lot of those games either didn't come out or did come out and were kind of mid, so they didn't sell all that well. But even on top of that, there's games that did perform well pre-lockdown that just didn't perform well when they came out after. Like, Rise of the Ronin is a game that I think about a lot, not because it's amazing or anything like that. I thought it was really cool and I'm excited to go back to it on my PS5 Pro, but like, it just seems like a game that really should have sold more than it did. I was looking at Neo and Neo 2 sales. Those games were million sellers, and I'm pretty sure Rise of the Ronin did eventually get there, but they put that game on deep sale pretty soon after it came out. And it's a game I look at, and even though it doesn't have amazing graphics and the performance wasn't incredible, it was good enough, and it just didn't move the needle for a lot of people. I know another big factor there is the economy as a whole. People have less spending money. Everything is insanely expensive. Thankfully, prices are coming down a little bit, and hopefully they continue to as the next 4 years go on. But like, if you don't have a lot of money to throw around, you're going to take less risks on games that you're not super excited for. And unfortunately, Sony took a lot of risks getting a lot of games that were kind of out of left field into production right before everyone's money ran out. And it's just like this perfect storm of everything that can go wrong going wrong. So I know Sony's getting a lot of criticism lately, and honestly, some of it is warranted, but they're at the top right now. The Nintendo Switch 2 isn't out. No one really cares about Nintendo right now. Xbox is fucking around in the McDonald's play place trying to figure out what their strategy is for their entire company going forward. And even with Sony's problems, I mean, between all the hardware manufacturers, the only two that seem to have it figured out are Sony and Valve. I mean, Sony's making a few mistakes and Valve's definitely doing a better job in my opinion, but they have far less people to impress than Sony does. They're the biggest console out right now, and when you have that pressure on you, I mean, you got to think ahead 20 steps, and then the one thing you didn't think of comes back to bite you, you know? I think they're heading in the right direction, kind of demoting Herman Hulst. I think he's made some pretty mediocre to bad calls, especially with Concord being his baby. I'm glad there was some retribution within Sony where he was demoted from co-CEO, and I'm glad to see things kind of recentering in Japan. I thought it was cool during the PS4 generation when, you know, everything moved over here in the US because there were a lot of great Western games coming out, but the Western games are just falling apart at the seams. They don't run well. They don't look good. They're not innovative. They're not listening to the people who actually want to buy these games, and they're paying the price for it. And apparently they refuse to learn. And reading all these Shuhei Yoshida interviews, it really does seem like he was a driving factor behind a lot of the best games we saw during the PS3 and 4 generation. So despite everything happening in the United States, a dude who grew up in Japan and mostly worked out of Japan was the dude calling the shots with all the games that were coming out. So when I see things moving back to Japan with Hiroki Totoki and Hideaki Nishino running the show, it's hard not to think that was the smart move, since Herman Hulst has had years to figure this shit out, and all he's pumped out is a bunch of Horizon games, and he's apparently working on more. So yeah, I definitely see where they're coming from over over at Eurogamer talking about whether or not Sony is coasting, but I don't think they're coasting. I think they are worried, and I'm glad that they're making moves to kind of fix the mistakes that are coming back to bite them right now. As I've been saying a lot lately, unfortunately, it just takes time for these things to shake out. I feel like in the next 2 to 3 years, we're going to see PlayStation kind of regain its stride, and I hope that happens because I just don't want to live in a future where every company is Microsoft, where they're just like, you know, putting games out on everything, not really having any brand identity. They're probably going to get rid of the whole Xbox name and network and everything like that. And if I had bought into that ecosystem, I would be pretty bummed out. And I just don't want to see that happen with PlayStation. I'm sorry. But speaking of Xbox, because of their whole brand falling apart, you would think that they're doing horrible. But because of all these acquisitions they made, like buying Activision Blizzard, buying Obsidian, buying Bethesda, buying all these different studios, the games they're putting out are actually getting decent reviews, and they're getting subscriptions on Game Pass, and stuff like Call of Duty is selling really well on PlayStation. Like 85% of the sales for Black Ops 6 were on PlayStation 5, so they are making money. And I know people get testy when we talk about these companies buying studios, but I've seen a lot of people mentioning that Sony should buy Take-Two. And if you don't know who they are, they're the parent company of 2K and Rockstar. So if Sony bought Take-Two, they would buy Grand Theft Auto, which would be buying the biggest game in the industry. And honestly, as enticing as that is, and knowing how much competition Xbox is providing with games like Black Ops 6 and everything like that, I think that would be a pretty dumb move on Sony's part, because we've seen how this plays out with Activision Blizzard being bought by Xbox. I think the only reason Xbox is walking away from trying to compete with hardware, is walking away from having true first-party games, is because they just spent way too much money on Activision Blizzard. It's the same fallout I was talking about in the last story, where there was a lot of money going around during 2020 to 2022. They had a lot of extra money lying around from Microsoft. They spent a lot of money on Activision Blizzard. The money started drying up, and then they had to have results, which results in them having to put their games on other platforms. And Sony, they're not necessarily in as dire of a situation because PlayStation is their biggest brand. And if you look at the financials, I suppose it could happen. Like Sony's market cap is something like $136 billion, and Take-Two is worth $37 billion, but it's not a flat transfer like we saw with Activision. They were bought for much more than their market cap suggested they were worth, because, you know, they want to make money on top of whatever they're getting from the shares being bought out. So while Sony could afford it, I just see that going down the same road as what's happening to Xbox, where it's going to accelerate that future I don't want, where PlayStation ceases to be a hardware manufacturer and becomes just a platform that releases games. Like, I just don't want that. I don't want a world where everyone has to go buy a gaming PC and deal with all the myriad of problems that I constantly deal with on PC that I don't have to deal with console. Everyone loves talking about how cheap building a PC is all the time, and how like you can build a PS5 Pro worthy PC for around the same price or even cheaper. But like once you start gaming on PC, you realize that those people are not playing on PC because they make some takes that are just clearly uneducated and stupid, if I'm being honest. Obviously, having Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead Redemption and I guess Midnight Club and everything else would be huge for Sony. They'd be making money left and right, but you got to consider that there's no reality in which they'd be allowed to make that exclusive. I'd assume the FTC would come after them for one thing, and for another, if you're going to pay tens of billions of dollars for the company that owns that IP, you're going to need to make that back fast, or else your shareholders are going to come to your building with knives and pitchforks and be crazy. So then they'd be forced into a corner where they have to release Grand Theft Auto on the Switch 2 and the Xbox and the PC. They'd have to spend a lot of money getting their first party studios to help out finishing these games. Like, it just honestly seems like more trouble than it's worth. And I think there's better studios they could pick up out there and still reap the rewards that Microsoft is reaping from their huge acquisitions. But you know, just fill out your roster with smaller studios that are making great games. There's plenty of them out there, and you don't need to spend tens of billions of dollars to get them. Sony's always been good at this too. Like, if you look at what they bought Insomniac for, with how many games they've put out in the PS5 generation that actually pushed the hardware, it was a relative steal compared to how much Microsoft's having to pay for publishers like Bethesda and Activision. And you know, I just think there's better ways they could spend the money instead of buying a studio that costs 37 or more billion dollars. Like, this stuff is fun to think about and talk about, but like, you make one bad move with an acquisition like that, it could not only bankrupt Sony, but it could just end the whole brand of PlayStation as a whole and relegate them to third-party party publisher for PC. So yeah, I get the train of thought because you see Microsoft owning Activision, you see them owning Blizzard, you see them owning Bethesda, and then you look at what Sony owns, and while they do have great studios, nothing's really bringing in the revenue that something like Microsoft gets out of owning those studios first party. But like, I just don't think Take-Two is the one that they should get. I don't understand why they didn't end up buying From Software. I think that was a huge miss on their part, but hopefully they can find some better studios to pick up in the future. That's clearly what they're trying to do with these China and India hero projects, where they're like fostering small studios in these Asian countries and building up their games. Hopefully they can figure out how to buy these studios from their weird governments. But that brings me to the end of this midweek video. As always, guys, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching and shape on.